one of the cedars. There are a ring of trees here in the entranceway to the Botanical Gardens in San Francisco. We are at the end of this moon cycle in our imposed calendar, January 24th. Many of the trees here are awakening. You can see the magnolia there. And we are about to enter the between where the moon passes away. This circle of trees in the entranceway, this circle of trees forms a family. They are all connected, though they are of different species. Most of us are unable to directly contact the consciousness and beingness, the who-ness of trees and plants. This is not true of everyone. And for those who are able to contact the living essence of trees or plants or animals, we differ dramatically in our concerns and the way we are in the world. We differ dramatically in the ways we are in our minds. Many people might believe that trees and plants and even animals or insects have no contactable essence or being or identity, awareness, consciousness. For a number of different reasons. Some have thought structure that implies to them that it's impossible for plants or animals or living places or insects or bacteria or fungi or protozoa to have meaningful experience of identity and relation with other beings. Many of us are trained to think this way by the assumptions implicit in the supercultures whose models of reality in the world, identity, consciousness, meaning, communication, and role we inherit. However uniquely we may inherit them. And it is surely possible that not all of the people who do believe or have experience of directly contacting other living beings and places, animals and plants, histories and futures, some of those people are having an experience that is more or less irreal. It's not necessarily that they are imagining, though their imaginations are involved. It's also that they can have a narrative, a story about it. And we use stories to ground us and help us navigate. That first word is important. To help us navigate the experiences that we have as human beings and as conscious agents in the world. But narratives are also dangerous because they can be delusional. And they can overpower our capacity to directly contact what's going on, what our potentials are, the intelligences that comprise our bodies and minds, and relationships, and the sort of costumed opposites of intelligence that we will regularly encounter in social and cultural, political, commercial, evidentiary culture. Much of what comprises the supercultures and the cultures we are exposed to at birth and throughout our lives is wrong. By which I mean is false. There are layers and layers of falsifications that we are taught to attend and emulate from childhood onward. And this is very tragic. To understand the actual nature of our humanity, the opportunities of our humanity, we must pierce the veil of culture, including the veils of science and religion. Now, some will say, well, science isn't a veil. Science reveals things. It's not untrue that science reveals things. But the portion of reality in our humanity that science is capable of revealing to us is modest. Science is very young still. And the purposes for which science is often enacted, for which research is done, can have underlying orientations and agendas that are dangerous or false, or simply inhuman. So for these and many other reasons, much of our accessible and demonstrable humanity, the faculties and abilities that we are born with the potentials for, will for many of us remain undiscovered and undeveloped throughout our lives. And our exposure to culture and language, narratives, models, science and religion is a many-bladed thing. For all that these things reveal, they hide other things, other aspects of our human potential and opportunity, intelligence and ability. I don't want anyone to get the impression that I'm anti-scientific. That's certainly not the case. In fact, most of my young life, I hoped to become a scientist. But as I grew older, I became suspicious not of science per se, but of the applications which scientific research are forged into by the elements of our cultures that make use of them and that fund science. So I'm still fascinated by science, physics, biology, astronomy, mathematics, which is perhaps a separate question, domain. Psychology, neurology. I'm fascinated by science, and I pay attention to what's going on in various branches of scientific endeavor. And I value the insights that science brings, but I'm aware of the potential for scientific knowledge to include other forms of knowledge, other ways of knowing. And what I want to speak about today is the broad spectrum of potentials embodied in our human birth and existence, and how many of these will never be discovered by us because we will become confused by the models and ideas and narratives we are exposed to, and there are different kinds of confusion. One can be, for example, religious or spiritual, and at the same time be completely deluded about the actual relationships and opportunities and lineages and abilities that relate to the more or less real world of the invisible, so that one can be blinded by taking on a narrative or belief. One can be blinded to the very thing the narrative or belief proposes to reveal and grant learning access to and relational access to. And this is not uncommon. Now, part of the reason is because we are trained to use vehicles to approach things that are invisible. Most of mathematics is invisible. Mathematics is a tool that allows us to approach relationships, quantifications, identities, algorithms, and so on. But one could have a sort of magical belief in numbers and never discover mathematics, the real formal opportunities and insights and ways of knowing that mathematics represents. Now, I myself am rather poorly mathematically educated, although I have some sort of relatively feral experience of mathematics. But my point is that we don't know what it means to be human. No one can tell you, including me. There are things we can say that are reliable and can be tested and explored. But my simple point is that we must become able to determine, to have some way of relating with the difference between an idea, a belief, a delusion, a narrative, and something that's more or less true and accessible and real. Now, by real, I don't necessarily mean physical. I mean not merely an idea. And I mean something truthful. So I am suggesting that for most of us, the vast majority of our capacities, the capacities inherent in our humanity, implicit in our human birth, will remain hidden from us throughout our lives, and we will become busy and concerned and motivated by and upset by things that are culturally imposed. And not all of these things are explicitly harmful. Some of them are useful or important. It can be difficult sometimes to discriminate between those two possibilities. For much of what determines whether something is useful or important is our orientation in relation to it, not so much the thing itself. The magnolia trees are flowering, but many trees are budding, not merely the magnolias. This garden is one of the premier magnolia collections in the world, as I understand it. And in the evening you can smell them, but like many of the plants here, since this garden is a world garden, their natural symbiotic relationships are missing. The pollinators for whom the magnolias fill the night with perfume don't live here. This isn't to say that there are no nocturnal pollinators, but rather that the natural symbionts of many of the organisms, particularly the plants and trees here, their natural friends and relations and enemies are missing. They don't live here. And I wonder, well, I don't really wonder, I suspect that in some relative sense, these plants are lonely. Because organisms are not distinct, they don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in shockingly sophisticated relational manifolds of unimaginable complexity and beauty and depth. And in that depth, there is joy, there is wonder, there is awe. In that depth, we find the origins of these human emotions that have acquired terms to refer to them. But to circle back, I think the vast majority of our actual nature and potential as human beings is hidden from us because we have stories and beliefs, ideas and models that either deny it or fail to introduce it, or denigrate it during introduction. In order to understand language, we have to be introduced to it. If we are not introduced to it by others who use it, we will not acquire it. And we don't merely need to be introduced to it. We have to be introduced to it, generally speaking, in an early phase of life. There's a phase of our human existence during which we are primed for linguistic and cultural uptake. This isn't to say that it's impossible for us to acquire it beyond that prime, but it's very difficult, and in many cases can be shown to have failed. A particular example, which may be relatively anecdotal, is the example of wild children. Children occasionally discovered living in wilderness areas, sometimes with animals, dogs, etc., monkeys. who are then returned to human culture but cannot enculturate and cannot really learn language. So this is an example of the necessity of introduction to understand our human potentials and opportunities in nature. We either have to be introduced directly, or we must become very curious and discover these things for ourselves. And there is the danger in this process of delusion, particularly because we are a kind of animal whose narratological consciousness is both dangerous and domineering when unbalanced by its twin that from structure produces meaning. So one of the things I am saying is that a person who believes that they can contact the living essence of a tree may be mistaken. And though they may be mistaken, this does not mean that the living essence of a tree is not part of our natural human relational environment. And I say that it is. I say to you that the nature of our actual humanity is so staggering that if for a moment 1/1,000,000th of it were to be clearly revealed to us, we might perish of ecstasy and wonder and awe. And it would be a nice way to go. If you got to go some way, that wouldn't be a bad one. But most of us prefer to continue living. And perhaps this is part of the reason why the vast spectrum of our human abilities, opportunities, and nature remains hidden. It's partially because there are aspects of these relationships that are so profound that they're cognitively explosive. And were we to encounter them directly, unprotected, they might shatter our minds. That's not a good enough reason to avoid them. And we can approach them cautiously with awareness and reverence and respect in ways that will tend to protect us from the incredible, staggering depth of what it truly means to be human, as opposed to what we've been taught to think it means. Again, however, we need some kind of introduction. We must be very courageous and become pioneers and explore directly. Certainly the ordinary person will, as if there is such a thing as an ordinary person. Again, it's a trope. Whether it actually exists is highly suspect. But if we were to select random people on the street and ask them, do you have any experience of communicating directly with a tree or having a tree communicate directly with you? Certainly many of them will say no. And if you ask them, well, do you think that's something that's possible? Many of them will say no. Or if they're a little more honest and generous, they'll say, I don't know. I know that we can directly contact not merely the organisms in the environment around us, the organisms in our own bodies, that their essences are intelligent and intelligible conscious and available. And it's not really necessary to assert that they have those qualities in the absence of our own minds, though I will assert that. Yet somehow the nature of our humanity is like a kind of relational light that, when it illumines the field of possible relations, things that were otherwise impossible become not only possible, they exist. They come into existence, they are born. And so it is that the capacity of human concern and interest awakens the potential for relationships we would consider to be ridiculous or impossible, many of us would, or magical. And the idea of magicality emerges from precisely the concerns and awarenesses I hear in circle. It's very difficult to encounter intelligent humans, by which I sort of mean delusion-resistant humans, who have discovered and preserved the knowledge and the orientations and the concerns that would unlock the door to the astonishing richness of our human opportunity and potential. Yet there is evidence that something is very afraid of all of this. Something in human culture has been fighting to shut down aspects of our natural relational potential and eros and opportunity. More than one thing. But we can see that organized religions were extremely concerned about people who, for example, might be able to speak or be or relate directly with the essences of living places and living beings. And in many cases, organized religions decided such people should be exterminated. And with some degree of success went on campaigns to accomplish that task. This was especially effective in particular places at particular times. The South and North Americas are excellent recent examples. Previous examples include Australia, Africa, the Middle East. Perhaps most of the places on Earth. Eventually, the humans that fear, the humans that know nature, find their enemies. There's a beautiful hawk in that tree. And when I say we have the capacity to contact nature, I am asserting there's something even more interesting than a magical or metaphysical world. Something not separate from everyday ordinary physicality, and yet it is distinguishable from that. What I'm trying to get at is You don't have to be any kind of special, you don't have to have any special badge or name or role to begin to rediscover your capacities as a human being. Passion, curiosity, interest, intelligence, wonder, awe, reverence. These things, these qualities are sufficient to begin and continue on the quest. Sometimes the gardeners here are not particularly careful, and they injure the plants near where they are gardening. And occasionally that presents an opportunity to help one of the plants, or to acquire a little piece of sage or an herb, a medicine. I don't mean medicine in the ordinary sense, but rather in the ceremonial sense. Because I am curious and have been filled with wonder about living beings my entire life, and also about the nature of humanity, I've been very fortunate and privileged to both learn, to be taught by others who know, and to discover things which have long been forgotten, or have been told stories about, or have been relegated to the domains of superstition, or have been relegated to the domain of magic. And as I said, you don't need a badge to learn and discover the unimaginably rich opportunities implicit in your humanity. This isn't to say that it's not useful to have footsteps to follow. As I mentioned, there are many things that it helps for someone to hint at, for someone we respect or revere to imply about our nature, that can catalyze our ability to begin the journey of discovery ourselves. And this is the only way that truly works, because even if you have a mentor or a teacher, a grandmother or a grandfather, ancestors in your lineage who knew that you can contact somehow, you'll still have to do the work yourself. And you'll need a bit of luck, whatever that may mean. Although science can't quantify luck, scientists are aware of its existence or impact on their capacity to succeed in a research path where they're chasing a question. And having a really good question, having a question that draws you ecstatically and enthusiastically into quests, into searching, into wonder, into observation, participation, experiment, is absolutely crucial to restoring the potentials and opportunities implicit in your human incarnation. A very, very precious gift, this form we have somehow been lucky enough to acquire. For we stand in a way outside of nature, and in another way beside nature, and in another way within nature. And we can choose which of these positions to validate or authorize. Yeah? Technology, primarily, science and culture stand outside nature. They overstand nature. And that leads to catastrophes and atrocities that are hidden so that they may be perpetuated. Discovering and yelling about atrocity is one of the features of humans that stand beside nature. Yet it's not particularly effective because the forces in our cultures and supercultures and commercial cultures and war cultures and prison cultures and so on are extremely highly organized, incredibly effective, extremely wealthy, powerful, well-practiced. They have methods, they have tactics, whereas the people who stand beside nature have not yet acquired that degree of sophistication that would be necessary to respond meaningfully and effectively to the forces that are obliterating life on Earth in the name of something they very confusedly and almost hypnotically call progress. Allow me to suggest that if the ancient ecologies fall, if the anciently conserved animals and plants and symbiotic relationships, millions of years old, if those are obliterated and they are being wiped out wholesale, science and technology will have proven to be demons. And if we wipe out life on Earth, or even if we wipe out ourselves, nothing we have done that we thought was good will matter, because the story for us, for our people, will come to an end. And all of our dreams and struggles will be shown to have been in vain. This is a tragedy I would like to avoid, though some would suggest that the Earth would be better off without us. I understand the pragmatics of that orientation very clearly, and can agree pragmatically, except that our species is probably the single most expensive experiment that our world ever engaged in. There's a vast and staggering investment that nature has made in producing and sustaining us, and I suspect we have astonishing abilities and purposes that, were we to imagine nature as intelligent and having purposive foundations, we would recognize that an animal like us is important. That nature might strive to produce animals like us for very important reasons, and might even be willing to make incredible sacrifices. Whether or not that is essentially true by itself, we can decide whether it's true by how we are human, together with nature, in and as nature, in the ways we stand beside nature, and even in the ways we stand outside nature. And those latter ways are very peculiar things indeed, and depend, I strongly suspect, on peculiar aspects of the evolution of our brains and their lateralization, which is to say how different kinds of faculties and abilities are physically embodied in the two cerebral hemispheres, but also probably in the organs of the brain beneath them. Because of our strange developmental history, we, it seems, alone of all the living things have the capacity to overstand nature. And so to develop tools and technologies that can then compete against our own survival. Of course, it's not as though they are doing that on their own. We are doing that with them. We are doing that for them. And they are not beings, they are just objects of a very peculiar kind. Like the one into which I am speaking and looking at the moment. We probably won't get rid of language or technology or the fact that humans overstand nature. What we have some hope of doing is transforming the purposes for which that happens and the outcomes of those situations. Many people would think, well, we should just get rid of the things that are messing up the game. It's not really possible. It's not very likely. Though it's not implausible that certain kinds of catastrophes could have that effect. So again, I want to highlight that most of the faculties and opportunities implicit in our humanity will remain hidden from us throughout our lives. And they relate, in my experience, to the deep curiosity, intelligence, passion, wonder, enthusiasm, and awe with which we pursue them. Our chance to know of them depends on these things. And we must resist delusion and narratives in this quest. We must learn to recognize the difference between a belief and an experience. And perhaps we must also be willing to test somehow, to have some way to make this distinction. To distinguish between ideas and fantasies, not that they are necessarily bad. Fantasies can lead us to discoveries under the right circumstances, but they can also lead us to delusion, to the belief we have discovered something that in fact is not really happening. I know it is possible to directly contact, and by the way, I want to back up for a moment. We're not the only animal that's lateralized. Even insects are lateralized. Birds, mice, rats, pigs, dogs, cats, all of them are lateralized. And yet, the peculiar history of hemispheric lateralization in our own species has produced something capable of standing outside of nature. And that's ironic. We must be I think it's important to be very curious about this. And one of the signal differences of our species is that we have formal verbal language. It's not clear that any other species has this kind of thing, though a few appear to have something at least relatively similar to it. But I think that because we are what I call formally representational cognitive animals, meaning that we think and communicate in representations that are formal, that can be written down in many cases, at least in words, and sometimes in mathematics, and sometimes in algorithms. We are extremely unique among the living children of Earth. And I believe that our species has a very crucial role to play in the biosphere that remains for us either undiscovered or lost in history. And it seems obvious that many indigenous peoples were aware of this. Some of them may still be aware of this. And it is from some of those peoples that I've been able to piece together a path for myself to continue the exploration and the work of recovering the nature of the essence of our humanity and what its potentials and opportunities are in the world of living beings, and in the world beyond living beings as well, in the universe of time-space. Perhaps in worlds that are not physical and yet somehow exist, or either exist independently of us or come into existence by our participation. And this is one of the other things that I think is very difficult for science to get a grip on, is that many features of our human potential don't exist unless they're enacted. You can understand this from your own experience. Again, if you're not exposed to language, you don't acquire it. If you're not exposed to human culture, you do not become enculturated. If you're not trained in mathematics, you don't suddenly one day dream up mathematics and start doing it. If you're not exposed to computer programming, the same thing. Though there were pioneers, right, with Turing and von Neumann and such, who, although they were not exposed to computers, their exposure to mathematics led, and their, endless fascination and drive and curiosity led them to imagine and then invent them. Interesting word, invent, yeah? To inwardly vent, to bring within. So many of the aspects of our human potential remain mysterious and await not only our discovery and our invention, they await the illumination that our passionate curiosity and questions comprise. Some of the potentials of our humanity require that we participate before they emerge. They are not sitting there like something waiting to be discovered. They are something that is waiting for us to become them. Yeah? So it's not as if, for example, that tree over there and that tree over there need me to speak or to relate with each other. Yeah? And yet, if I, in my imagination and also in my heart, not just in my thoughts, if I imagine that I can connect them in ways that are ordinarily not possible without me, something unique may occur. Pragmatically minded people are afraid of delusions, with good reason. But their fear of delusions also deprives them of the potential to explore things that don't come into existence without their impassioned participation. And they will not see those things because their pragmatism, useful though it is, does not represent impassioned participation. Everything responds to love. All living beings understand love, what we refer to as love, in some way. Now, understand is a complex word. Let us say they are capable of being aware of it. So that when we direct loving attention toward a living place, a living being, a living array of relationships, now we are participating in a new way. Reverence, fascination, wonder, awe, these emotions awaken the potential for non-ordinary experience in human beings, in living places, and in living relationships. And I say to you that if you will come to these living places and relationships and beings, awakening these emotions, you will discover things that seem to be impossible. You will discover forms of communication, forms of intelligence, other minds, the in nature opposite of human cultures, modes of dreaming, modes of travel, modes of at distance communication that our technologies emulate and fail horribly to approach the profundity of. Before there were radios, there was telepathy. Before the word telepathy, there was something deeper than telepathy. Before there were televisions, we used to dream together. We still can. Some of us still do. The living world is a network of minds and intelligences and transports that make what the humans have done with freeways look like monkeys trying to paint in feces with their faces and getting very excited about the results. The actual intelligence embodied in nature is so staggering that, again, if a billionth of it were revealed to any ordinary human being, their mind would shatter. They would not probably survive it. And yet, we have the capacity to approach and rediscover and recover our humanity while the living places and the creatures yet exist. In this brief moment, in the between, where the humans are wiping out the intelligences from which their own minds emerge moment to moment, because they have forgotten this, because they have no experience of it. Our species has become like an idiot child, or perhaps a child isn't the right word. Our species has become an idiot in the sense meant by the word in an ancient language, which meant to live in a bubble of unknowing, separated from truth and relation and knowledge that is veritable, that is good. And we've become embubbled in this way, our species. Though each individual is unique, the species as a whole, the supercultures, act consistently in ways that are omnicidal and that are obliterating the foundations from which I would argue the possibility of our intelligence emerges moment to moment, and upon which the possibility of our intelligence depends. When those are gone, we will go with them. Let us find some way to ensure that never happens. And even if the house is on fire and will truly burn down, even if there is no chance for us to stem the tide of omnicide that our supercultures enforce, even if that terrible tragedy is true, we have the capacity to live beautifully and heroically, to walk in beauty together, to shine with the essence of our origin and true nature, in spite of the terrifying disaster that is befalling the living world and our own species. So the fact that we may not win, the fact that things may actually collapse, does not mean there's no hope. What it means is we must live beautifully in the moment and realize the preciousness of the remaining time when the ecologies still exist and the animals are still modestly present compared to what once was. Just as if our own house were on fire, right? And we would rush in, perhaps heroically, to rescue people, our families. So the fact that we face a crisis, and that the crisis may be unstoppable, in some ways makes it only more imperative that we rediscover the essence of our human nature and potential, intelligence and abilities in nature, with and for each other and all the living beings of Earth. I have barely scratched the surface in my lifetime of something so deep and staggering and shockingly beautiful that it obliterates all the stories I've ever encountered. The sum of them look like nothing compared to it. A lifetime is a short thing compared to the anciently evolved conservations of the living beings around us, their intelligences, their relationships. A human lifetime is a very brief thing. And yet within it, we have the potential to recover and discover and explore the unimaginable beauty that the potentials we carry, like seeds, can become when they discover a context in which it is good and reasonable and opportunistic for them to emerge. And this is very important. Context matters for human beings. We are social animals. Most of us in isolation will suffer greatly. And so we must somehow create contexts that encourage these explorations and discoveries, recovery missions, pioneering missions. The real frontier is not space, it's right here. It's the living beings and their relationships, it's the origin of our own minds and bodies and intelligences. It's the recognition of what was lost when we became a technological animal, and what those technologies are being drawn from and are representing. So I encourage you to join me in this quest. A quest, I'll say, is natural to all human beings, but accessible only to some. We must be lucky if it is accessible to us, because for the vast majority of moderns, the things I speak here of are either invisible, absurd, bizarre, delusional, impossible, or otherwise conceptually inhibited. Last night I was at a lake, and it's very difficult to see bats in the darkness against the water. But as I stood near the lake, in my heart, I loved the bat people. And I called out to them in my heart, and I made an image of them flying in my mind. And I felt reverence and wonder and love. And I sang to them in my imagination, hoping they might come. And after a time, I felt a ping in my mind, like an answer in an aspect of myself that there's ordinarily too much noise to sense. And then, a moment later, the bat showed up. And then another. And soon there were a few. Now, one can question this. Or one can embrace it. But it can also be tested. In a way not precisely scientific, but more or less emoto-relational, right? Things that are true of heart don't want to be tested. Yeah? They don't want to be the subject of experiments any more than my friend wants me to experiment on whether or not we're actually friends. And yet, it is possible to gently and respectfully explore whether a relationship is real or just in one's thoughts, in a way that is pragmatic over time. I've had many such experiences as the one that I described with the bats last night. I know there are hidden faculties within us that were forged over hundreds of thousands of lifetimes, millions of human lifetimes, in nature with living places and living beings. These faculties have been lost, yet they can be recovered and even developed to degrees that exceed everything that has come before. And if you are of a mind to explore your humanity in this way, then you and I are together. And you and I and those like us will encourage each other and help each other and teach each other to remember and recover and develop these crucial aspects of our human nature, intelligence, opportunity, and ability. For now, the living places still sing their beauty. And though they are endangered, aspects of them are thriving. There are aspects of our human essence that can transform themselves, that can inhabit living places, plants, animals, that can travel in the living networks, that can learn from other intelligences. Perhaps long ago this was thought of as magic. I prefer the term nonordinary. It is true to my experience that these things are real. And in fact, they have a class of existence that's meta-real, because it's more than merely physical. It doesn't necessarily make it after the physical, metaphysical. I think it's a natural result, or maybe even precedes physicality rather than coming after it. The physicality, the forms and embodiments of living beings and places in nature reflect this proto-forma. And much of our humanity is like this. It's pre-form. It's before formality. It's that which formality makes its derivations from, not after. There are modes of dreaming and modes of passion and engagement so profound that they can only be understood as miraculous by moderns. Let us become them together once more, and make proud our ancestors. And make beauty of the peculiar circumstance we find ourselves in. Though we stand on the brink of disaster, there is a possibility to become something so beautiful that all the struggles of our people and all the sacrifices of nature can be shown to have been meaningful. For what we do now changes the meaning of the past. And if we can be truly beautiful and intelligent together now, the suffering and confusion of our history, its meaning will transform. So too shall we.